Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF, thank you again for joining us in this interview with الشرق Business. This is our third interview, but the first in Morocco. The first two interviews were in Dubai. Thank you for joining us today. And let's just start with Morocco and the IMF and World Bank annual meetings that will be held in Marrakesh this year. It's a great opportunity, the first time in 50 years in an African nation. What are the main themes that those meetings will focus on, and how are they different from the spring meetings in April?
Yeah. Let me start by thanking Morocco for hosting the annual meetings. It is the perfect country. Why? Because it is on the crossroad between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. It is not just a place where goods move, but ideas move. It has rich culture and very dynamic economy. When we come to Marrakesh in October, there will be three very important sets of issues for us to discuss. The first one is how we can more rapidly address the key economic challenge of today, inflation. Yes. We are making progress. Globally, we see headline inflation trimming down, but core inflation is very stubborn. Why do we want inflation to go down? Because then interest rates will go down. And also for poor people, inflation is a huge threat to them and their families. Second, we will discuss the longer-term prospects for growth. What we face today is an economy that has not been moving fast, and that unfortunately is our projection for the next couple of years. 3% global growth year after year. We are going to discuss sources of productivity. For sure, we will talk about technological advancements, artificial intelligence, what are the opportunities and costs that come with it. And thirdly, we will talk about how we can bring the world closer together. There is strong interest of agreeing on principles for international cooperation in a world where we are seeing more and more winds of fragmentation blowing. Since we are on the African continent, there will be huge attention on how Africa can prosper, how Africa can make this century Africa's century.
Great. What legacy do you want to leave after leading the IMF for those meetings for the first time in an African nation in 50 years? What change do you want to have intertwined with your name?
Well, the most important change is that the fund brings not only the technical excellence of its staff, but also empathy for people. That we recognize policies are for people, and we always have to think about the impact of these policies, how we can make it so that the economy works for everyone. I am also proud that the IMF has done a really good job during COVID and now to reach out to its members. We have provided financial support to 96 members since I started in my position. And I am also proud that I will be in Marrakesh for annual meetings on the African continent.
That would be great, and people will remember that Mrs. Georgieva was the IMF leader who spoke for people. So let's talk about the global economy. It's usually said, and it's a cliche, but I always like to mention it, when the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. And this is what's happening. Why should the world be scared about a regional banking crisis in the United States, debt ceiling crisis, which thank God was solved last minute, a strong dollar that is the effect of restrictive monetary policy, that is in effect a reason for this, because of this inflation and all the loose monetary policy that was practiced during COVID years. The strong dollar that is really burdening the emerging markets and emerging economies as well. Is it fair for all the world to have to withstand all of this burden?
It is important to remember that the US economy is the largest economy. And right now, the US economy is performing better than anybody expected just a year ago. And when the US is growing, it creates demands for goods and services, and that is positive for growth everywhere. Where you're right to express concern is that when inflation is high in the US and the Fed has to raise interest rates quite abruptly and then keep them high for some time, that leads to dollar appreciation, and that affects emerging markets and developing economies. What is the remedy? Well, above all, what I started with, fight inflation, bring it down so interest rates can go down. We are projecting inflation to remain, unfortunately, above the targets of major central banks all the way into 2025. So what should countries do? Make sure that you pursue structural reforms that help you grow faster. Invest in your people so they are more productive. Remove barriers for private sector to invest, attract more capital, and build the strength of your economy as Morocco is doing on the basis of reforms.
Now let's talk about some reforms. Since you've mentioned reforms, the UN Secretary General recently called for reforms for the institutions that emerged out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, particularly the IMF and the World Bank. What reforms are they talking about? Are they talking about a major structural change or just few reforms?
Let me start by saying that the World Bank and the IMF have been transforming over the decades. The IMF had two major changes. One, when the gold standard ended, and the IMF was the institution to help the world move to flexible exchange rates. And the second time, when the Cold War ended and the former Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, my country, joined the IMF, and it expanded significantly. And of course, it has to continue to change. Change the instruments we offer to our members so they fit the needs of today and tomorrow. We are doing a lot of it. We have to do more. Just to give you an example of reforms we have undertaken, one is to provide grants to our poorest members during very tough times, during COVID times, so they don't have to pay us back when they're barely helping their own people. This is called Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. And for countries in desperate situation, it came very handy. We also have created a new instrument, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. First time in our history, we offer long-term concessional loans, 20 years repayment, 10.5 years grace period, low interest rates, to countries to transform their economies that are now under threat because of climate change or pandemic. And the importance is that we are offering this to all vulnerable countries, middle-income countries and low-income countries. First time an international financial institution offers concessional loans to low-income and middle-income countries. Where we need to go, we have to continue to reform the IMF so it reflects the changing structure of the world economy. We have a review of our quotas that has to be completed this year, and we have to continue to listen to our members, to listen to their people. So what we do truly meets the needs of nations. And when I look at the world, work with others. No institution, not the IMF, not the World Bank, not UN, no one can solve the complex global problems alone.
Exactly.
Work together.
You mentioned something that was not actually on my points here, but you mentioned that the IMF is always there for the vulnerable nations coming out of a pandemic. What about those coming out of a war? We have countries, Ukraine is still in this war, and it's really still tough there. The IMF has stood up to help Ukraine. What about countries that are getting out of war, like Syria, for example, the countries that were affected by the earthquake, Turkey and northern Syria? How will the IMF help there?
You are very correct to talk about fragile and conflict-affected states. We actually adopted a new strategy so we can expand the offer to countries that are in dire situation. Sometimes the IMF is not the best instrument because the best instrument is a grant, and then either the International Development Association of the World Bank is more appropriate to help. But where we want to be a source of support for the members is to be more attuned to what are the needs in fragile states that the fund can help with. We are expanding our presence in fragile states, placing more resident representatives there where it is hardest. And as I mentioned before, we are reaching out to other organizations, including UN organizations. We have a situation when we actually provided our support jointly with the World Food Programme, so the country receiving financing from the fund could then rely on this financing turning into food right away.
So the IMF could stand up and help those countries in dire situations, but they have to be in need of the IMF more than other
instruments that we are the right institution to help.
All right, let's talk about Morocco, the Moroccan economy. There has been an ongoing discussion for many years about floating the exchange rate here fully. It's now plus or minus 5% only, but it has always been criticized internally that the Moroccan economy is still not ready for that because they're not a highly exporting country and they cannot bring in a lot of foreign currency. Now that you've seen most of the Moroccan officials during those past few days, and you have been here, do you think the Moroccan economy is ready for a fully floating exchange rate?
The Moroccan economy has advanced significantly. It is a place where exports have grown, including exports of industrial products. Just look at the automobile industry here. Yeah. 700,000 cars exported. Shows that the country has moved up on the value chain. They are producing parts for airplanes. They are now a leader on renewable energy. I had the chance to visit Noor, the solar plant. It is incredible, such an achievement to make Morocco a potential solution, not just for Morocco and its neighbors, but also for Europe. So in this environment, it is good for Morocco to think about moving towards a fully flexible exchange rate. We have full trust in the governor of the Bank of Maghreb here in Rabat. We have full trust in the government, and I'm confident that they would make the right decision at the right time.
All right, let's talk quickly about Egypt, because before your time ends up. So for years, the IMF referred to the Egypt example as an exemplary case. Then, apart from the exogenous factors, COVID and the Ukraine war, what has gone wrong there in Egypt that they have reached this dire state that they are in terms of the economic situation? And will the IMF be able to do its first review in September as previously planned?
We are having a very good discussion with the authorities of Egypt. They are taking appropriate steps. Just recently, they have agreed with IFC to use their expertise to accelerate privatization of state-owned enterprises. Egypt has done many things right. Where Egypt has to assess the changing global environment and also how they want to advance competitiveness of the economy are in three areas. The first one is get the state out of activities where the state is not the best to do them. There is full understanding with the Egyptian authorities. It is a must.
Yes.
Make it so that private sector flourishes and creates more jobs, because we know this is a critical issue for Egypt. Two, Egypt can do more to move support to the most vulnerable people and reduce the kind of support that benefits also the rich. They have done a lot. I want to praise them for that. But they can do even better. And three, they need to think of ways in which they can make their reserve position stronger. We have discussed it, and I'm confident that, as you asked about the review, that we will make progress.
So in September you will be able to do the first review?
We are aiming to have the first review
Yes,
completed.
And last but not least, so you're talking about privatization and the subsidies. What about the floating exchange rate? This has been one of the major pillars of those reforms required. There has been some criticism from the president about this floating exchange rate. Will it still be a major pillar of the reforms needed for Egypt now?
We know that when you have multiple exchange rates, you actually create privileged positions for some and not for others. We also know that when there is a support for the currency but not enough foreign exchange, then shrinks the reserves and makes the situation of the country more difficult. How exactly Egypt goes about it, of course, it is not only an economic question, it's also a question of political economy. But it is important that actions are taken to protect this leakage of foreign reserves, because otherwise what we would have is it's like putting water in a bucket that has holes. So, but how exactly to do that? We are very open to continue our discussions with the Egyptian authority.
So the
I have
discussion will
high
continue.
respect for President Sisi, and I trust that working together, we can make the right. He can make the right decisions for the country.
Thank you so much. So the Egyptian economy will be seeing the review in September as previously planned.
We look forward to that. We are looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF, for giving us the time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you in the annual meetings.
Look forward to it.